Well, I am Patrick Farrar, and thank you for joining us for another installment of the Opinionated Stance podcast. Please do me a huge favor. Visit opinionatedstance.com. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We are watching. If you have any comments, questions, show ideas, please reach out. We always love to hear feedback from our listeners. And thank you again for listening to all the shows. The love is very, very much appreciated. Today, we will be exploring the topic of how to build a software product. We'll specifically look at what it takes to grow, build, and retain a development team, and how developers can identify product opportunities in the marketplace from a different perspective than a product manager. My guest today is an esteemed colleague and mentor, Andy Abbott. Andy is a technology entrepreneur in Chicago who has co-founded multiple startups, including Booked Out, which was acquired the past fall by the Chicago-based firm ShiftGig. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming here on your Saturday afternoon. Some people that are listening might not know your entire background. So why don't you fill us in on the story about who Andy is, the man, the myth, and the legend before we dive in?
All right. I don't know about legend, but maybe a myth. So as you mentioned, I was the co-founder and CTO of Booked Out. Managed that through their acquisition of ShiftGig or by ShiftGig. For those not familiar with Booked Out was a two-way marketplace connecting marketing agencies with brand and promotional staff. Recently, I ventured off to pursue another idea, this time in the legal tech space. So currently, I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer of a company called Heretik, and we're building an artificial intelligence platform to empower organizations for smarter, faster, and more efficient legal contract reviewing. I'm also the founder and community leader of Microsoft's largest developer meetup here in Chicago, host monthly meetups on various topics, obviously focusing on the Microsoft tech stack. But so I think we're at like 1,500 members now, so it's a pretty large group.
I did not realize it was that large.
Yeah, it is now the largest Microsoft group. It has been for
nationally or
no
in Chicago.
In Chicago, but nationally, I think we're in probably the top 10.
That's cool.
Maybe even the top 5. So it's definitely one of the go-to kind of meetup groups if you're in the Microsoft tech, or if you're just a developer in general. We do topics outside of Microsoft tech stack. So ChicagoDev.net is the place to go if you're looking to see kind of what we're about and where when the next meetup is.
Very cool, very cool. So before we dive into this, I think it's going to be a great conversation because our topic ties into really kind of what you're you basically described there with your background as you're a CTO, you built out technical teams, and you're actually in the process of building out a product. So I think it's going to be good to take in let's just go in and start talking about what it is to build a software team. So you said you founded multiple startups. What has been your common experience when taking and building out a software team, maybe in Chicago or professionally, in other markets that you've worked in?
Yeah. Obviously, I'm a little fortunate because I do have a pretty vast network through my meetup group. I'm able to find kind of and pick and choose probably a little bit more than a typical, entrepreneur, especially when you're looking for tech talent. However, what I try to do is really focus on what the problem is, what I'm trying to build, and who would be the type of person and the developer to help me with that.
Okay.
So, and because is this an example? Booked Out was a smaller, I would say, tech problem from a complexity. However, we had to build a very nimble multi-platform solution. So cloud-based with a mobile focus, and it was a very our end user was very a 20 to 27-year-old. So presentation mattered, especially in the marketing and advertising space. So
so set up the product a little bit. I mean, I know that you're not working on it, but what was the market that you were trying to address? So you had the technology mobile, you had a desktop solution. Set up that project and set up how you decided to identify who you needed and when you needed to bring them on.
Yeah. So we, as I said, our target audience was really these very ambitious, young kind of individuals. So they're anywhere from 20 to 27 years old. They're focused on promotional marketing. They're basically, they're brand ambassadors. So these are the people that you go to, a stadium or a football game, the Bears game, for example, and there's in the parking lot, there's always brands handing out free samples or getting you to sign up for promotions. All those staff or all those individuals are not employees of that particular brand.
So they're all individual contractors.
Yeah, they're all contracted out either through a staffing agency or through various other means. But so we, in order to address that market, we realized that these individuals were always on the go. So it's not so we couldn't build a typical web platform or a software product if it wasn't mobile focused.
Okay, so would someone ever be on like two different brands that they would be representing, like have to go from one to another?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That happened quite frequently.
Okay.
So, an individual might have a gig Saturday with, at the stadium, and then Saturday night they might be, slinging liquor shots at one of the bar to sample a various alcohol.
Story of my life.
Yeah, yeah. So they were usually working 2-3 plus brands in a given week, and sometimes even on top of their day job. So they might be working. They might be a barista for example at Starbucks during the week, and then at nights they go and do liquor promotions, and on the weekends they might be handing out sample products at the Bears game or whatnot.
Okay, so the market was you have to take and build a application for them to be able to interact with their projects that they have to go to and be in the right spot. Yeah, so that's what you had to build.
Yeah, in order to get their attention, we knew that we had to be in front of them, and they're always on the go, so they have their phone on them.
Right.
So the target was obviously mobile. We also knew that it just from kind of research and stuff that we were dealing with pretty much a split of iOS and Android developers. So we knew that we needed to target, if we wanted to kind of go after the market quickly, we needed to build something that could target both platforms. We could either do that natively or we could build a cross-platform product. There's where came kind of the decision from a infrastructure and cost standpoint. Who can we bring in and find what developers exist in the market? And that's where we actually chose to pursue the native build out, just because there was a larger talent pool in the Chicagoland area. So we could easier find an iOS engineer and also an Android engineers. And we actually, rather than bring those on site and hire them directly, we actually contracted through a local dev shop to build out that part of the product, because we knew it was a concise short-term build out for the MVP product, and then we could manage it and going forward with a smaller staff. So we didn't want to bring in kind of full-time engineers initially, just to prove the concept. Okay,
so two questions that I have right off the bat was, when you started working with the booked out product and this opportunity as the CTO, what was the headcount? Where did you get to? And then the other thing was, what was the technology stack that you used besides the iOS, the Android, and so on?
Yeah, so when I met my co-founders, I was the only technology
and one is the loneliest number.
Exactly. So that was fun, because it's not just building the platform. It's also managing the expectations with business, because all my co-founders were all business people. So it's managing their expectations, then dealing with kind of the product roadmap. We didn't have any product people. That was actually one of the first people I went after, was to bring somebody in with product management experience that could help me kind of take those job duties off of my plate, so I could focus a little bit more on developing software.
Right.
But yeah, so once we kind of got the mobile stuff in order, the rest of the platform was all cloud-based.
Okay.
Obviously, my connections with Microsoft and my experience with the cloud, I went after Microsoft Azure's cloud platform, because of just familiarity. There's also a great program that Microsoft offers called BizSpark, which gives you a lot of support and even some cloud sponsorship for early stage startups. And so we leverage that to kind of kickstart a lot of our cloud development, remove some of the infrastructure costs, because we wanted to be as nimble as possible. I didn't want to have to bring in an infrastructure engineer to manage servers when I could build off what's called PaaS, Platform as a Service. Right. So you basically are building off the cloud, and then Microsoft manages all your servers. So you don't have to deal with that kind of headache. They're obviously going to be much smarter than what...
because they're going to know how they already set the things up and put the wires.
They're the best of the best
right.
for infrastructure engineers and system engineers. So that removed a lot of costs just by choosing the cloud. So we had our mobile teams working. We had my focus was then on the cloud and the back end. I was building that out, and then it was really just staying heads down and getting the product to the market.
Okay. So do you feel like that the most of the challenge when you were trying to identify like building the team was like trying to figure out, okay, we need one person to do this, one person to do that? Like, was there a number that you had in mind to take and know, like, from the market opportunity that you knew you have in software development, you have a phase where it's heads down, you get an MVP out. Then you have okay, we got the MVP out, let's get feedback, let's augment that. And then you have a scaling side of things.
Yep.
Which was did you have a roadmap right off the bat? Like from what you needed to know, like of what people you needed to go find?
Yeah. There's always, I think always different paths to take. And it really depends on the circumstances.
Okay.
So when I was working for Booked Out, obviously it was a startup. So we're focused on getting product to market and, getting that first dollar in the door.
Right. Get that revenue
yeah.
in so you can have that, plow that back in through growth.
And at the time we were raising money too. So we had a plan to, a growth plan, how to grow the team, who we need to hire first, when, and what for. But that never works out. One, it doesn't work out because just all the other stuff going on. But also there's times where an opportunity comes, whether it's a business opportunity or even a hiring opportunity, to where you might have to change your kind of path a little bit to take advantage of that. So, we did have a specific kind of growth plan, who we were hiring first, second, third, or whatnot, but you deviate a lot. So nothing that I don't even know, probably if I, went back to that plan and looked at it, it was definitely drastically different than the reality of what occurred at Booked Out. However, so if you're, that's I would say a startup kind of path. I also have, a lot of experience in large enterprise companies and hiring as well.
Point. Yeah.
And that I think is a little bit more predictable and more focused, to where you have they'll just be apparent that you either need to spin up another team, or you have, some product and business requirements that just need additional help, or experience that you might not have internally. So you might, get to a point where your database is outgrown kind of everyone, all your individual developers kind of managing it, or you might have one engineer who's kind of taken ownership of that, but at some point you'll probably end up bringing in a DBA,
right,
or a team of DBAs, and that's just growth, to where you, as a technology kind of manager, you can quickly identify your needs, and it's budget based, obviously,
for sure,
and it's just you take kind of, okay, here's all our problems, here's kind of the growth that we need, and then what's the budget?
Yeah, absolutely. So like once you've identified that need, like you're going after, let's just keep it, I don't want to go to like a DBA, let's keep it as more of a generalist. You need a full stack engineer.
Yep.
Like you say that you're either an established firm or whatnot, you're going to go after that particular talent. I'm not going to say piece of talent, but you're going to go after that person, that talent. Where do you go find that person?
Yep.
Like, what is the marketplace? I mean, you've worked in Chicago, you've worked anywhere. Like, I think that we can extrapolate the data points from Chicago to a lot of the other major technology markets. I'm going to use that as an assumption for this, but like, where do you go? Like, once you have that need, how do you actually go and get that person?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone will agree, and even regardless of the candidate or the position, whether it's engineering or not, the best place to find people is your network. or your employees' networks. And I without a doubt, all the top kind of candidates that have come in throughout my career, all the top employees have been usually through personal networks or my employees' personal networks, because it's kind of, they're already pre-vetted,
right?
And if I'm bringing somebody in, I'm putting my reputation on the line for that person.
Yeah. You're vouching for that person's success.
Exactly. So that's ideal if you can tap into those networks. And there's actually some software and companies that have come out targeting specifically that problem. However, that's usually, that's not always the case. So,
that seems like you can get lucky doing this, but that's not the norm. There's other avenues that you'll have to take and address and like filter out stuff.
Yeah.
So
and there's points to where you can't, either you tap kind of the network dry, or there's points to where you need to focus outside of your network for specific reasons. And that's when I think it becomes a little bit more difficult. And it really depends, I think, on the size and maturity of your company. If you have internal recruiters, it's great because they take, it's not an easy task to recruit in the market, especially in the technology market, because the market, especially in Chicago, is saturated. There's not, I would say, many developers that are on the open market.
There's high demand.
There's you're typically poaching.
Yeah.
Especially if you want good, talented people, you're poaching them from existing jobs, and they might not even be looking at all. It's really, how do you find those unicorn developers,
right?
And where they're at, and how do you get in touch with them?
Yeah.
And I think that's where. I think it does make sense to bring in people who are experienced with that. And if internally you have, those recruiters, then great. But if you don't, it's worth looking into the recruiting market and find some firms or find, independent recruiters that you're comfortable with and can trust, and work out an arrangement that makes sense for your company.
So do you think recruiting and this kind of goes into the next question I have is, it looks at more of like what are common challenges that people may encounter when recruiting talent and retaining that talent once they found it. But more often is recruiting and hiring a short play, or is it a long play, or is it something that is deemed by company culture as well? Because that's a huge thing too. Like, being a demand driven market where it's a developer's market, they're going to want to have certain things, and they know that if you're trying to recruit them into your organization, you don't have those things. They can just, I hate to say loyalty is few and far, but they can go find, there's somebody always reaching out. The amount of LinkedIn messages that you get and I get are astounding about people wanting for our talents. So what are some things that, what are the challenges that people may encounter at firms, software teams may encounter when recruiting and retaining, and what does that look like from a scale from your perspective?
Yeah. I think the first thing you want to do is get candidates in the funnel. So you got to source them somewhere. And once they're in the funnel, then it's really making yourself attractive. And that's not something I think that you can just turn on. It's not like, a faucet to where you can turn on and make your company attractive.
You can't just have pizza and beer on Wednesdays and then you're an attractive organization.
Exactly. And you gotta realize what is attractive too. To something attractive to an engineer is not going to be the same thing that's attractive to, say, an operations person, or maybe an executive.
So what would, going on that attractive part, what's attractive to you as an engineer? What have you seen from your personal standpoint is beneficial from you to be a highly productive member on an engineering team? Yeah.
For me personally, it's just the challenge. I like problems that aren't just kind of, I go to work basically to be challenged.
Right.
I don't want to show up and kind of just be given tasks and, clock out at 5. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. If some people actually pursue stability, and so they want they want to go to work to basically make a living so that they can support their life outside of work.
Right.
And so it could just be a 9-to-5 job, and and even in engineering, that's the case. So there are companies that that's kind of the goal. They have work and they have people. And I think the larger your company is, so large like enterprise companies get to a point to where it's literally just. And I even saw, I think a tweet that the engineer is the next blue collar worker. And I think in some cases it is, to where you go in, you clock in, you do your work, you're given tasks, and then you clock out at the end of the day. And for a lot of people that's fine. For me, that's not. I'm going to work and wanting to be challenged, and it's also different in the startup. So it's all about the type of company, the type of culture, what you're building, and I think you got to look at that, especially as an executive team, and figure out what you want your company to be and how you want it to be perceived in the market.
Yeah, because I can see it from like a standpoint where a lot of different sales organizations and other firms will focus on like the free beer and the pizza and the open work environment and this and that and the other thing. And those things don't personally affect me. Like free beer, I can buy my beer. It's probably better than the free beer that's getting there. A ping pong table, I don't like ping pong. I would rather have a environment where I can focus on developing a task, completing that task, and not just like doing that, we got to do A, B, C, D. It's like thinking about a product more abstractly. And I think a lot of different people in the marketplace are like that too. Yeah. But yeah, I do see the other side of it where some developers are just I'm just going to grind because I'm good at grinding, and that's what they're going to do. Yeah, I mean,
it's very highly paid job. So it's not by any means a bad thing. I think you just have different types of individuals. You have different types of companies, but it's making sure that if you want the types of engineers, like I was describing myself, as the go-getters, the people that are looking for that challenging role, you got to make sure that you're offering a culture that creates that.
Yeah, that fosters that thinking environment. So it's more of a long play, and so you need to take and also be able to not just have the narrative be short. You need to have it be vetted, because like I know my engineering network of people that I talk to. We know, we know what firms we want to go to work for, and we know what firms we don't want to go to work for, because the word gets around fast, because it's like, oh, this is, Johnny's firm doesn't let you actually work. They say they do, but they don't let you think about that. Like, do you see that happen when you talk to other people as well?
Oh, for sure. And I get a lot of people, both, recruiters reaching out to me, companies reaching out to me, looking for candidates, and then also candidates looking for, their next gig. And I always try to match them with what makes sense. And one of the first questions is, it's not so much what their experience is. It's always like, hey, what type of company do you want to work for? Do you want to work for a large company? Do you want to work for a startup? Do you want, kind of the stability? Do you want to travel and consult and deal with consulting? Right. And so before I even get into kind of experience, it's really defining and what they're looking for from a culture standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then from there, connecting them with, the organizations that I know that makes sense.
So for you, what's more important, recruiting or retention?
Obviously retention is ideal. However, it's not, I don't consider retention being, if somebody decides to go, mm-hmm. That could be a good thing. And not just because, it could be a bad thing to where if I didn't provide them what they were looking for. Right. However, if they're getting, if their next role is something that I gave them, the opportunity to prepare them for, then that I consider that a success. Yeah. And there's one of our investors that booked out had a great line that he shared with us that he looks for employees, and when employees start with him, he's like, what can I do to prepare you for your next role? Right. On day one, he says that to the people coming into the door. And
knowing that that's going to be that they're going to leave at some point.
Yeah, in time. And he doesn't. Especially in today's market and in technology, you're looking at any engineer that comes in is probably a 2-year rotation.
Right.
I mean, I would bet the average is right at that, to where they're going to stay with you for 2 years and then they're going to move on to their next role. Some people stay longer, some people stay shorter. But if you look at just looking at all the resumes that come in, when I, in recruiting people, it's about a 2 to 3 year kind of span of people, when people, especially younger candidates, will stay at a firm and then they move on. And that could be from growth. The company just got too large and it kind of lost their appeal, or, they're ready to move on and they want new challenges. I mean, it varies. And that's, you have to reevaluate your company to ensure the culture still exists. To attract the types of people you want working there.
That's interesting. It popped into my mind. What are your thoughts about attracting people, as like knowing that there's a cycle, right? What are your thoughts about attracting full-time employees versus going the route of having contractors come in, where you're potentially working with an agency of record or even working with an offshore team? In this whole, because that's a method to grow fast. I mean, there's probably pros and cons to each of those strategies, and there's reasons why you do one versus the other. Do you have experience working with any of those different types of things?
Actually, all of them.
Okay.
And I consider that, part of my toolbox, to where I view kind of the problem at hand from how much engineering effort is this going to take? How much budget do I have? Is this a long-term situation, to where I might have a need for a front-end engineer, but that need might only be for 3 months.
Right.
And then after like this product gets out, I might be struggling to find them work. So for that example, I wouldn't want to bring somebody in full-time, just because I know after this project, I don't have another project for them. And the worst thing you can do, especially in a smaller company, is be creating work for employees.
Right.
You always want to make sure that you're kind of balancing that act of having enough work for your current staffing. And if you don't, then look at other options. One could be offshore. One could be bringing in, a contract individual, and it really varies. I mean, offshore is great when you need to build a large workforce, and even to, cost is always what people throw around there. But I also look at it from, I can find offshore teams that are a well-oiled machine. So they're, to be able to hire an entire team all at once, and that have worked together on various projects. And the same thing goes with, local consulting shops, where you're finding that team so they can quickly dive in and start working in on the project.
Because they have their microprocesses and
you don't have to, they don't have to ramp up as much. They don't have to kind of deal with team dynamics as much.
Right.
And then, some of the benefits are they can self-manage to some aspect. Offshore is a little bit more difficult because obviously the time zone, the time gap, and then also sometimes the communication gap can be a struggle. But once you figure out how to deal with those situations, then you can really leverage them to build some great things.
Yeah, so I think with the offshore thing that you need to take in, not just you personally, but people need to take into consideration when they're going to go that route, is there's process involved that you need to be more of a highly on-touch manager to take and make sure that you're getting what you want. And this is perfect because it goes into my next thing. So you need to be able to talk about different things that to be a highly functioning development team. You need to have like specs and all these other different things and product stuff. And you alluded to it when in the first comment where you're like, first thing I did is I went and found a product person to take that off of it. So what are some processes that are important when developing that highly functioning development team? And also in your mind, what is a highly functioning development team?
Yeah. I think the more this comes into play all the time, but the more effort you put into a problem up front, the better you'll be with the results.
So you don't just start coding away and hacking and smacking?
No, I mean, sometimes you have to, but
right.
And this you'll see this, the the larger the company gets, the more process comes into play because mistakes are expensive. So if you're developing a product and you don't hit the mark of what your stakeholders or customers want and have to re-engineer it, that's a very expensive mistake.
Okay.
But if the more research you do up front and be able to identify exactly what you need to build,
Yeah.
and then be able to deliver on that, obviously, and to deliver the first time, the better you are. And it's it might be costly up front, but I think ultimately you're saving costs because you're not having to re-engineer something that you already built.
So to hit that mark, how do you put quantifiable or objective goals onto what that is? How do you define what that piece of problem that you're trying to solve that with code and technology?
Yeah, so a colleague of mine has this concept of defining the steel thread. So it's kind of getting to that minimal viable product or proof of concept, or it's the best case scenario, and building that out and then getting it to your stakeholders as fast as possible so that they can give you feedback. You can make changes or adjustments prior to kind of building out the whole product. And that's, this is the concept of waterfall development versus agile development. To where the more iterations that you can take in, the more feedback that you can get during your process, then you ensure that you're building kind of exactly what everyone's looking for, and then get to a point to where it might be the 80% complete, but it's good enough to go to market, and anything past that 80% is just not worth the return.
Yeah, diminishing returns. For that. So, is there anything that, from a standpoint going into that, processes in Agile that you would recommend teams do when they're trying to find out what that mark is? I think one of the biggest problems that I've always seen in startups specifically, but is the lack of documentation or user stories or understanding just the what, because any developer can code stuff and make it good. But there's always the afterthought of oh, this is a bug or this is a bug. It's well, we didn't think about that in the whole thing. So it's not necessarily a bug. It's just it's a missed requirement. Yeah. So what tools do you recommend teams, highly functioning development teams, strive to put in place? The Agile process talks about sprint planning, it talks about stories, tracking, all these different things. And I think most test-driven development is on that main focus. What have you implemented successfully, and what have you first off, what have you implemented that hasn't worked, and then what has actually worked?
Yeah. I think, again, doing as much research and kind of work ahead of time before you write that first line of code is important.
Right.
The other thing that I try to do is remove a lot of the tedious stuff from the development process. So one of the first things I always do and my teams always do is set up continuous integration.
Okay.
So that we're not constantly having to push out code and build and deal with kind of getting our actual, proof of concept or current, version to our end users. It's just, we set it up initially, and then we can, as soon as we commit our code, it automatically will get deployed and notifies the end users. And then
it would be tested too.
Yeah. And then they can run tests and then our end users can provide feedback. So I think that's key because it's a lot of tedious work that over time you might not, initially it might not be a big thing.
Right.
But over time that actually does cost a lot. Especially if you're doing that manually. Yeah,
debugging and figuring out what type of code is on this actual server versus actually looking at the CI logs and see, it's commit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 versus it could be any of these commits that somebody has thrown up there. So that's obviously a good practice.
Yeah. And a component of that is getting having an environment to where your developers can actually use the product. There's a lot of, I think large software packages to where you're developing in your dev environment, but it's not actually similar to what is in production or the actual product. It's like a hacked together version, and then you work on this and then realize once it gets released, it actually is different than there's something different about the environment or whatnot, and you run into problems. So we at Booked Out, we actually had multiple environments that mirrored from an infrastructure standpoint exactly what we were doing in production.
Okay. So you had a dev environment, you had a staging, you had a UAT probably, and then you had a prod, so you could see where like the code would go across those different processes.
Yep.
So they would touch not the same data in the databases, but they would touch the same schema. They would touch the same API endpoints, and the boxes were set up all the same there. That's interesting. Like, so did you guys use just straight VMs to take and do this? And was it running there, or did you use something like Vagrant or any of those tools to kind of create a local copy of it that you could just blow away?
We weren't. So our infrastructure was PaaS, so it was 100% platform as a service. So we didn't have, the only VM we actually had in our infrastructure was our build server.
Oh wow, okay.
So everything else was actually platform stuff, which made it very easy to deploy and manage. The pitfall was we actually required network. So and
you had to have an internet connection.
If I'm developing, I had to be online.
Okay.
There's parts of it that you could do locally, and you could run the majority of the project locally. But we ultimately would deploy a lot of our code to the cloud just so that we knew that we were connected, everything was running smoothly, and we could then bring in the mobile apps as well, and ensure that everything was working as expected. But that was our use case. Doesn't always need to be that way,
right? And
it really depends on looking at what your problem is. And with Heretik now, we're 100% different. Like we're actually running VMs, and there'll be a little bit more infrastructure that we need to build out, and less kind of platform stuff.
But it's a different product. It's a different end goal, and so you can't really take and put the same blanket solution on every different product. You use the right tool for it. So
so tooling. Tooling is important, but you can't say this tool works for these cases. It's really kind of exploring kind of your needs and looking out in the market and seeing what's there. I'll tell you
it's processes that are the important part. It's not the tools that you use. Okay.
Because we even initially at Booked Out, we were agile, as every company is these days, but
which isn't a bad thing.
No, but rather than have some massive kind of tool to manage our stories and stuff, we actually were just using Post-it notes and a whiteboard.
Okay.
Because we just wanted to get the process going and didn't want to, especially a lot of our interactions were with non-software kind of familiar people, a lot of business users that never had built software before. So my co-founders never had worked for a software company before. So I couldn't, if I would have introduced a tool that required them to be online and deal with all these stories like, Jira or, TFS or whatever other ones you want to look at. Pivotal. There would always be hurdles that they wouldn't use it. They wouldn't figure out the process because of the tool.
It wasn't in their ecosystem or their environment.
Yeah, it was the tool's fault. Yeah. So rather than do that, just simple Post-it notes and a whiteboard, and then they understood the process. And then from there, as we grew, then we brought in some tools that made sense for our engineering teams.
So what was the first thing that you had those people that were non-technical do that helped you to be able to identify the problem correctly? Like, were there planning meetings and discussions about what that Post-it note was and how that Post-it note should have been addressed, like from the development team and the product? I'd say the product owner, the person who is putting that feature out there, to like discuss the viability of, this is going to take 6 weeks, this is going to take 6 months, this is going to be 6 hours. Like, were those meetings had? And if so, how did you go about like starting to actually implement that process?
Yeah, we did as much as we could. We weren't perfect, and I don't think anyone should be. We got, had as much planning meetings that made sense with the business stakeholders, got as much information out of them as we could, and provided them with as much information as they were willing to take. Then from there, we would work separately as an engineering team and do what we needed. So we would have full-on sprint plannings and stuff internally as our engineering group, and then would expose the stakeholders to as much as they were kind of willing to participate in. And it eventually, as the process would go, the product was delivered, the iterations would get out the door. They understood the what we were doing more and more, and then the buy-in came, more and more. So it's a evolving, I think.
It's a long process.
And you see the same thing in large companies that are looking to implement agile.
Yeah.
Especially if they're used to kind of a waterfall. I've been through 2 large software companies that went from a waterfall approach to then an agile approach, and it wasn't something that you just did overnight.
It takes a lot of time.
It was a year plus before I think we actually had something working well.
Is there a quantifiable metric that you can say going through that agile process was better than not actually having stories or specs in there? Like, it may be really hard or subjective to think, but like, do you think you were more in tune with what the customer wanted going through the agile process than when you were just like, okay, we're just going to build this because we think we're going to need it?
Yeah, I mean, the more experience you have, the more that you'll realize when I don't do stuff up front, it bites me in the ass.
Yeah.
Almost every time.
Yeah.
So when we would release features and they didn't perform the way that we expected, or we didn't get kind of it wasn't necessarily the solution, kind of what the customer wanted.
Right.
9 times out of 10, it was stuff that we failed to do up front. So
Right.
it was either, if it was a technology issue, a performance issue, we probably didn't have testing coverage, accurate. If it was a requirements issue, we probably didn't, do enough research up front. If it was, a usability issue, we probably didn't have mock-ups done up front.
Right.
Or bring in a designer to ensure, a UX engineer to ensure kind of what we were building made sense from a usability standpoint. So all those parts, if you look kind of when stuff doesn't perform or it actually fails, look at back kind of how you started,
Right.
and more likely you forgot to do something, or just made at the time it might have been a choice to skip that.
Right. But know that you had a decision made there.
Yeah.
So I think, just to sum up this, like the whole thesis of this whole agile thing, because we talked about highly functional development teams, is, put the tools in place, get a process, get as much information out as possible prior to that first line of code, and know what, if you're going to take and say that you've actually, you're going to skip doing this, know that you've made a conscious decision to skip doing that, and it's not going to be fully addressed there.
And no, I mean, obviously, you don't try to be perfect, because you'll end up wasting, I think, time
and cycles.
Yeah, because ultimately the goal, end of the day, you're trying to get that product to market.
Right.
So there has to be a point to where, from my experience, and I've never been perfect, and
I don't think any of us have.
Don't even try to be. Like, there's points to where we'll make a obvious bad decision, but it's intentional, knowing that, okay, we need to hit this deadline, and so we're going to deal with subpar, performance initially, and then we'll go back and address it later on.
Right.
But
knowing that decision has been made is like, if you've taken, you might get lucky, it might not have any performance impacts, but knowing that if you cut a corner in terms of, like, you didn't optimize your SQL queries, or you didn't do this or that, the other thing, or you didn't have a build process, there might be a bug in there. That's we did this, that's why that's there. You can't expect it to be perfect.
Yep.
So I think that's interesting. I think that's a really, that's a good understanding from like a software side of things. Now let's kind of maybe shift a little bit of gears and take a look at the product side of things. Like how you're right now, you're in the thick of it. You're doing this. We're going to talk about, from a software perspective, how do you identify opportunities in the marketplace? How did you figure out that you wanted to work on some legal product, or any of the other products that you've done professionally, throughout your career?
Yep. I mean, I can't take credit for the legal stuff.
Oh, sure you can.
My co-founder actually brought that to me, but we went through some contract reviews during our acquisition, obviously. And so I was more familiar with the process. And then the more research I did, realized that this was a struggle across the board. So it's really just listening, I think. And one thing as an engineer is you learn how to problem solve.
Right.
So you learn how to kind of identify situations that you can improve on. And so my mind's always working on, what happens if, I did this or that, and how can I make this process better? And even, there's I think a funny story, and I wish I knew more of the details, but there was an engineer at a company that basically had developed enough scripts to make his kind of job obsolete, to where he was just going into work and not having to do anything because his entire job was scripted.
He automated himself.
But nobody knew this. And it wasn't until he left that they realized, holy crap, Bob has been sitting here for 6 months and everything he was doing was actually these scripts that he wrote.
Bob's a genius.
Yeah, and he's a true engineer. And so he just realized that, if I'm doing this tedious stuff, I can just write some scripts. So I think, and I mentioned this, I think earlier, is software engineers are, I think, today's, blue collar workers. It's getting to that point. But if you look at kind of, maybe in the 50s when stuff like, say you had a shed that needed to be built in your you have a house, you had a backyard, and you needed a shed to store some stuff. You'd just go to the lumber yard and build it yourself, or call some buddies over.
Right.
So it's the same thing that's happening today. These people, engineers, these kids and stuff, know how to code, and so they're building that shed with code now, and they're solving those problems. They have the capabilities, they have the tools in their toolkits to solve these problems.
It's funny, and I'm chuckling a lot because I just did that this week. I'm like, okay, I got
built
this
a shed, or
no, I didn't build a shed or anything, but I'm like, I really would like to have XYZ just on my desktop. Okay, why don't I write this little app right here that actually gets it and aggregates a couple things that I kind of want to see all the time.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's like, it's hilarious. Like, yeah, so I think you have a resourceful generation that is using this. Like, okay, I think it's not MySpace pages anymore. They're like actually using it to change how they're operating, how their lives are. So you said listening. Listening is a big thing. So let's just talk about the different places you can listen from a software standpoint. Like, you're obviously got this opportunity brought to you by your co-founder here, but how has other ideas approached you in the past? Like, I know that you and I have done startup weekends in the past, and that's an idea incubator, like where you can find a lot of stuff. But is there like any tried and true ways that you can like vet an idea once you've like heard it? Like, call bullshit on some things?
Well, I mean, some of it is just obviously BS, but I think once you identify a problem, it's really coming up with some kind of solution to that problem. Okay. But not necessarily building a solution, to where it could be literally wireframes on a piece of paper and say, hey, would this work, the concept kind of work, or figuring out the workflow, that it might all be manual, but if you can figure out that manual workflow, then it's easy to automate portions of that as you go. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if no one's willing to pay for it. Right. And so, how do you get to the MVP, the minimal viable product, as fast as possible to test out your solution to a problem? And a lot of people are capable of identifying problems and identifying the needs in the market, and even realizing, coming up with great ideas. But then they're like, well, I don't have the skill set to build, right? Or I don't have the skills to do that. Where they differentiate themselves from entrepreneurs are the entrepreneurs are like, well, I don't have the skill set, but I'm gonna figure it out. Yeah, I'm gonna go and I might not know how to code, so I'm gonna draw up these wireframes on this piece of paper, which is an MVP in and of itself, because you're giving what that idea is to some stakeholder. Yeah, and so as soon as you can get buy-in from another individual
Right.
about your solution, I think that's when you know that you have something there. And so, like for this this contract review process, the buy-in was my personal experience.
Okay.
Like we struggled with identifying parts of contracts when we were going through an acquisition, like whether this one clause existed in my employment agreement, or our service agreements with our customers, like who had what and what terms and all this stuff, and all these items that we had to identify, we had to do in a manual way. We weren't, a large corporation that could bring in outside counsel.
Right.
We had to do a lot of this stuff ourselves. So I very quickly realized that this process was painful, but then realized that this process was not unique. And so
you identified that there was a market, there was the problem, and then you identified that there was a market of people that are sharing a similar problem.
Yep.
And then so the next thing you did was what? Then you started to get some things out into the marketplace so they can test it, or how do you quantify, like, if it's like, because you have to do the math on it and say, is this problem a $10,000, $20,000,
Yep.
20 million? Like, how do you quantify that versus the time to build? Because if those economics, if you're trying to take and build something for profit, if those economics aren't aligned, then why are you going to do it? You have to have that business.
No, yeah, and that takes time and it takes research, and it's really just work. I mean, I spent probably a month just Googling, looking at different competitors in the market. Did some kind of a competitor analysis, and my team, did as well, and we identified kind of what currently exists, what's the landscape, where can we tackle it, and there was a lot of fish around the contract creation,
Right.
and so we knew that if we went in through there, we were just another fish. So we said, well, why don't we approach it from the review side for large merger and acquisitions where there isn't a lot of fish there. However, now we're dealing with the big players in the space, the large, some of the largest law firms in the world. How are we, as a non-existent company at this time, like, how do we become attractive to them?
Yeah, how do we even get invited to those tables to talk?
Yep. And so then that's when we found some leveraged our network. We were fortunate enough to have a decent network. My co-founders come from kind of an e-discovery background. They have some experience there, so they had a network in that space. And then my technology background with some Microsoft network and machine learning kind of experience and stuff. So combining all of that, we were like, hey, we actually might be able to go after this.
Yeah. So let's take that back, because you guys had a network and you have an experience, like you have a long background. You're in your career. You've done this for a while. What advice do you give to people that might be doing their first startup, or a younger crowd that's trying to take and identify for this with limited resources, limited network? I mean, we always talk about the hustle and the grind. What does that actually look like?
Yeah. The first thing I will say is don't quit your job.
Okay.
A lot of people like, well, I can't do this unless I quit my job. Yeah, you can. I think it's the dumbest thing you do if you're pursuing an idea and you quit your job. Not always the case, but if you have income coming in, figure out how to maintain that income while pursuing at least coming up with that MVP. So get to the point where you're testing out your solution in the market and seeing and getting that buy-in and getting that feedback. Then once you kind of get that feedback, then you can reevaluate and say, okay, in order to go after this, I need more time to focus on this. I might need to quit my job.
Right.
Or I might need to, work part-time or something. But the longer that you can maintain income, the better shot that you'll have at success, because ultimately, I mean, a startup isn't something that just you go and all of a sudden it's working, and a month down the road you have a paying customer. Whatever your timeline is, double, triple it, because it's never as short and easy, and especially your first time, you're going to make so many mistakes. The second thing I would say is find mentors.
Okay.
Find people that have either in this space specifically or just general entrepreneurs that you can tap into and say, hey, I'm looking for to do this part or to do this thing. I need some help with it. And those things are what legal entity do I need to set up. So find maybe a lawyer friend if you have one that is willing to kind of give you some advice, accounting,
right,
taxes, business contracts. There's a lot of business stuff that has nothing to do with your idea that's just going to consume your time. And the faster or the more input and mentorship that you can find, the less the less mistakes you're going to make, and ultimately the more time you'll have to focus on your original idea.
Right.
So in Chicago, there's obviously, if you're from Chicago, there's some great co-working spaces and incubators, one of them being 1871, which has just a plethora of mentors that are available. People who have been successful in their career and are willing to give back and help, new stage startups get their kind of company.
Kind of get their feet wet and kind of get like that. It's not necessarily accelerator. That's a different opportunity there, but it's someone that can help you, it can help you get to that network. You know, it can give you advice and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I think that's where you can differentiate yourself from others, is being able to tap into experienced mentors and even advisors in your industry, bringing them on board so that you're not having to go through a lot of the same mistakes that they made.
So in order to get those mentors, first off, is a mentor the same as having an advisory board?
No, I mean, yes, not really, but mentors I think are more personal, whereas advisors are industry focused.
Usually there's some sort
related
of financial...
they're related to your company or your startup.
Right.
So you'll bring in advisors they might be industry vets, or they might have, if you're doing something new with an industry, you might bring in somebody who has experience in that. So like, for instance, booked out, like we were doing, applying some logistics type workflows to the staffing kind of model. A good advisor for us would have been to pursue somebody in the logistics space. Chicago has a ton of logistics companies, a ton of very successful logistics people.
Yeah.
So it would have been very helpful for us to bring in an advisor. I mean, that's kind of an example of what I meant there.
Right. And so would a mentor be somebody that you'd want to bring in pre-validating your idea? Or is this something that you'd want to take and actually like be a little bit further down the road? Like, oh, I got an idea. We're going to build a gummy bear website. Andy, would you be my mentor?
Yeah.
Or would you just say like, okay, I've got this and I've used it and have a little bit more, because you want to be mindful of people's time.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but also, I mean, if somebody doesn't have time to help you out, then that's fine. I think when you approach, it's the more feedback you can get earlier in your company, the better.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I would go out and obviously initially I'd be focused more on the problem.
Right.
And figuring out how to solve it, then focusing on setting up my business idea.
Right.
Or setting up, or finding a lawyer to patent my idea before I even have tested it out in the market.
Yeah.
Like, I think some of that stuff is just is wasteful.
And it's financially wasteful too, because potentially patents are expensive, and if you're trying to do that, you could patent, fake dog poop, but if no one's going to buy it or there's already stuff out there, why waste your time doing that? So.
Correct.
That's cool. So that's like interesting. So getting a mentor is a key thing for it. Are there any other things that you could recommend, like in terms of prior to, like, it seems like it's mostly understand the marketplace, understand who you're going up against, do those competitive analysis, take and understand that marketing stuff. I think a lot of the things that, like a general thesis from segment 1 and segment 2 that we've talked about is, do your homework first before you write that first line of code, but know that once you've got your homework done, start to get it, write the code, and get that out into people's hands to validate that you have already seen the market assumptions correctly.
Yeah. No, and I think the key thing in all aspects of building a company, and whether it's or building a software team, is being aware of your surroundings and culture, and just constantly reviewing it. Because if you're a large enterprise company, it's going to be very difficult to attract a startup-minded person,
Right.
Because probably your culture is a 9-to-5 culture, so you might be wasting cycles trying to find that that engineer or candidate that doesn't necessarily fit your culture. If you want that candidate, then you have to look at your culture and how can you make changes in your culture in order to be attractive to that candidate. So it's it's a two-sided kind of marketplace there. To where, do I have the culture that fits this candidate? Is this candidate fits my existing culture?
Right.
And if it's out of balance, then it's not. No one's going to be happy, because the candidate's not going to be. If you lie about your culture, they bring it in, they realize it's not a good fit, they're not going to stick around.
Yeah, and in a Yelp, Facebook review kind of culture now, or that type of environment that we live in, Google reviews, anything, your reputation and the word can spread fast if if you're not forthright with what what you're putting out in the marketplace.
And it's the same thing. So if you have existing employees and all of a sudden you flip the culture, you might lose some candidates because they're not looking for the very vibrant kind of startup craziness. They want this very stable 9-to-5 kind of job, and so that's a thing to where you have to constantly review your culture. You have to constantly review kind of your processes and make sure that everyone's happy, and when they're not, make changes.
Very cool. What's your top experience to kind of like cap off this stuff? What's your top experience with growing and building a team? What's your most positive one that you've been able to enjoy the most?
Building a team, building a startup was crazy. I mean, it was, but by far the most rewarding experience I've ever done. Being able to provide, a fun workplace for great people, and walk in and see all of these like incredible minds working on, a concept that you had, and following you as a leader is it's not something that you get to experience often, and that was, I think, probably the most rewarding thing that I was able to go through, in the last few years. So
that's awesome.
Yep,
that's really cool. Andy, again, thank you for being on the podcast today. It was an absolute treat, and I, hands down, thank you so much for your time. And as I like to do with all the podcast guests that I have on here, is I want to just open the floor for you. You got a couple minutes. Anything you'd like to share with us? Like, talk about, like, candidly, uncandidly? It's all yours. The floor is yours, my friend.
Obviously, I got some new stuff going on, so it's going to be some exciting time in the next probably 6 to 12 months. Can't wait to go at this again and provide and be able to share a lot of the stuff we're doing, because it's a challenge that is challenging for me. It's probably one of the hardest concepts that I've ever tackled. So I am looking forward to seeing what we can come up with and how we can solve some of these problems in the legal tech space. So, but to find out more and to follow me, my Twitter is Abbott. So 2 B's, 2 T's. And the company is Heretik, and our website's heretik.io.
Awesome. And I'll link to all that stuff in the blog posts and stuff like that. And let's have you on again once things go a little bit further down the road, and we can do like a post-mortem about how Heretik's going.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to announce some cool stuff and share a lot of good wins.
Yeah, because I want to have a follow-up to hear about like how you identify the marketplace and used what we talked about today on this episode to grow your next software team. Again, thank you for sharing everything that you have. As I like to do with all of my guests, I like to give a little bit of a token of my appreciation to you for coming on the show. So Andy, there you go. Why don't you tell everybody what you're looking at here?
It's a Forbes magazine with Patrick's signature.
Yeah, an autographed copy of an Ashton Kutcher Forbes magazine, like I like to generally give out to my...
It's going to be worth some big money someday.
It's going to be worth something, at least like $2.99 or something like that. So Again, thank you again for spending time on your Saturday
Of
here.
course.
Again, check out Andy's website, link to us. If you have any questions, again, reach out to us on Twitter. We'll be able to do that. Thank you again for joining us for episode 8 of the Opinionated Stance podcast. If you are here listening and still haven't done so, visit the website. The internet. We are watching you on the internet. We're looking for you. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel. This content's going to be up there in audio form. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, show ideas, please reach out. We'd love to hear all from our listeners. Thank you again for listening to this show and the shows in the future. Until next time, cheers. We're out.
Thanks.